Good morning and welcome back to the lecture series on partition of India in print, media and cinema. So, we are discussing refugee women and patriarchal society, and we are going to discuss today Srijit Mukherjee's film Begum Jaan. So, Begum Jaan actually explores the problematics associated with border and map making. It deals with it in fact problematizes and questions the Radcliffe line, which was drawn arbitrarily and which actually ran through villages, through houses, in fact through natural topography, separating them into two. It actually went through rivers also, and this actually makes a very important, a very interesting case where a lot of critics ask how a river that is fluid, that flows, what part of it can be arrested and considered as part of one nation state as opposed to the remaining of the river belonging to the abutting nation state. So, how can we actually partition a river, something which is fluid, which is a water body. So the question of border, it is a violent concept, it is in the post colonial world, a world that has seen formation of new nations and nation states, partitioning of one nation into two. How can we accommodate the idea of very similar humanity, I mean very similar cultures, ethnicities and the larger practices of people in terms of belonging to two separate nations, where one would be one nation would be or inhabitant of one nation would be considered as foreigner to the other, whereas they are similar. So, Srijit Mukherjee is talking about the Radcliffe line. He says, the director Srijit Mukherjee says, when at the behest of the then Governor General Lord Mountbatten, the Radcliffe Commission shoddily drew the India-Pakistan border in just 5 weeks with no proper topographical or demographical study. It sometimes went right through forests, villages, rivers, towns and even houses. The movie is the story of one such house in Punjab and the fight put up by its matriarch Begum Jaan, who adamantly defies the order, the government order, and she says that no government can take away her, no government has the right to take away her home, right. So, it is a tale of a strong-willed woman who is by profession a prostitute, and she is trying to preserve her way of life in her brothel basically, and this humdrum life, this mundane life of a group of prostitutes is deeply touched. It is their lives are overwhelmed by fast moving events caused by and centering the partition. So, we see that brothels, I mean even if we think of the brothel as a space, it is generally a brothel is never at the heart of a town, because these are the marginal peoples, people that the clients meet mostly at the dead of the night, and these clients sometimes come from a very respectable strata of the society. They could be like in the case of Begum Jaan, we see the king comes, so we see the royalty coming, and then we have the policemen, the ministers, everyone come to this brothel, but in the daylight they deny this aspect of their identity. So, obviously a brothel usually is located outside of a town, and so Begum Jaan's brothel is somewhere in between two towns, on the outskirts, right, on the outskirts of two towns and somewhere in between these two towns. And so, the story is about the Radcliffe line running straight through this brothel house, and as a reaction to this decision imposed from above, the women are reluctant the sex workers are reluctant to give up their house, which is their only home. As we can see, many of these women, most of these women are partition victims too. They are victims of riots, communal riots. Most of them are rape victims. Their families refuse to take them back, and so they have resorted to prostitution as a means of living. Now, they do not want to give up their house, for they have nowhere else to go. So, instead of abandoning the house as the order was put up for them, they resort to, they recourse to a tough fight on the attackers. So, the idea of brothel once again harkens back the discussion on the liminal space, the third zone, which is neither here nor there. We were talking in the context of tamas, we were talking about the rababis, the ones that are born as Muslims, but who sing inside the gurudwaras. So they occupy a kind of liminal space. Similarly, in Mani Ratnam's Bombay, we see the position of the unisex. Although it is a very insignificant and short role that is played by this unisex, we see that the unisex or commonly known as hijra in Indian languages actually lives in a shanty, in a hovel, and but the humanity that he or she actually shows is amazing. It stuns the so called normal mainstream people who are at each other's throats. I mean, in the face of this, I mean, in this crossfire, the hermaphrodite or the unisex in Mani Ratnam's Bombay saves the two estranged children, the two abandoned children. The unisex saves one of the two brothers that that are estranged and that lose their parents, and they are wandering on the streets, the riot stricken streets. So we see the humane aspect of the unisex, and it is this unisex who later comes out and you know, reprimands the rioters, saying that you are going on doing some mad act, some rampant you know, killing. So you should the unisex begs for mercy and asks the rioters to basically stop you know, this killing spree. We see the third space coming out, emerging as very powerful in different ways. So they belong to neither of the two, you know, staunch groups. I mean, neither of the two groups that have their staunch ideologies and positions. Similarly, the prostitute. I mean, when we think of Mani Ratnam's you know, figuration of the figuration of the unisex, we cannot but also think of the position of the prostitute vis-a-vis partition. What has a prostitute got to do with partition? Her life is a kind of trauma, a living trauma, a daily trauma that she you know, she has come to terms with, and that she lives, that she has accepted. So, like I said in Begum Jaan, many of these women are riot victims, rape victims that are not taken back by their families, and so the figure of the prostitute woman and the idea of the brothel has been used by the movie, because a brothel as a space actually transcends the question of caste, class, religion, all these divisive categories that create walls among people. It puts forward the question of I mean question of where people like the prostitutes can place themselves during the partition. Where do the prostitutes belong vis-a-vis the entire partition drama or partition scenario, because they cannot really associate or own up their espouse their religion, caste, creed that they were born into. They are beyond that. So, So, Begum Jan basically calls brothel as her home, where customers do not worry or inquire about the caste, creed or religion of the woman. So, this is, I mean, sex trade is one of the oldest means of earning. I mean, as far as human civilization is concerned in different parts of the world. So, it is one of the oldest trades, oldest means of earning. And so, there is a kind of candor, we could say there is a kind of honesty about these women, which cannot where no external markers or man-made categories actually stick or hold. So, it is the bareness of reality, where the man is the client and the woman is selling her body, where the other aspects do not really hold, they fall apart. So, the feeling among the women is that they do not have any caste, they are all equals and they are all prostitutes, they are all abandoned by the mainstream society. So, the movie actually we could say the movie actually subverts and also points out to the loophole that is present in the idea of partition. How partition as an imaginary line, and I would like to harken back and recall Amitabh Ghosh's term shadow lines. They are not real lines, but they are shadow lines, and how these shadow lines, these imaginary lines that reinstate some extreme and violent aspects of humanity, that corroborate to the fact that two people from different belief systems, from different worldviews cannot coexist. How these lines actually destroyed the lives of thousands of common people. The line is supposed in this case to cut apart the brothel, and so one side of the brothel would belong to India and the other would belong to Pakistan. It is a very unnatural and in fact a laughable proposition, where within the same brothel house women are engaging in a similar trade. Half of the house would be half of the prostitutes would be termed as Pakistanis, whereas half would be seen as Indians. It is a laughable prospect basically, and Begum Jan vehemently disagrees to such a prospect put forward by the government officials. Even the policemen, at one point in the film, the policemen mock this imaginary line by saying that the Britishers were creating two nations or drawing this line as if for a kabaddi match, right. So, Gyanendra Pandey notes that in the context of 1947, a moment of quite incredible uprooting and violence, displacement in its physical sense refers generally to evacuation and migration. So, what Pandey is trying to look at is the different circumstances of immigration. While for the upper echelons of the society, it was more planned, organized, and there was a question of choice where they would like to resettle. There were a population, there was a significant section, a group of people from the lower rungs who had nowhere to go, who basically were being pushed from place to place. Here I would like to remind of the case of the Bengali Dalits. Basically, they came. The case of Bangladesh, which underwent basically 3 times it was changed from East Bengal to East Pakistan and further to Bangladesh in 1971, and the exodus happened in batches, in waves. So, it never happened at once, and these people actually wandered from West Bengal to the Andamans and then to Dandakaranya, and then they came back to Marijhapi only to be massacred by the government. So, they were being pushed around from place to place, and they have been wandering in search of a permanent home for decades basically. So, the making of common people into refugees was a doing by the partition. It was a deed, or partition was culpable for turning ordinary people into refugees in their own homes. So, Joya Chatterjee studies that in the recent scholarly literature about refugees, the refugees actually emerge in a new light, and so we cannot only see them as hapless victims of profound trauma, but as Chatterjee argues, I mean they are not only takers of collateral damage in this incessant process of nation making, but they are also recognized as critical agents. So, new scholarship also recent scholarship revisits the hapless refugees image by seeing how their actions and demands from below could also influence policies and change the state itself in ways that could not have been predicted. And this is, I mean, something we can relate with the post partition mobilization. In the post partition nation states, the mobilization by the refugees, especially in India, the strikes, the refugee strikes and the protests and demands put forward by the refugees rendered them a status not only as a victim, but also someone who could determine where they belonged and how they wanted to live. So, they had some decisions to assert about their own life. So, so we see that after the border is made, just going away from Begum Jan to our theoretical backdrop that would enable us to understand the plot better. I mean, what happens is after the border is made, each community, the Hindu, the Muslim, the Sikh, they are virtually synonymous with being either a native or a refugee or a foreign national, depending on whether they belong to the majority group or the minority. So, a Muslim in India is generally not a very positive figure, commonly seen. Similarly, a Hindu in Pakistan is certainly not shown in a very positive light, and so forth. So, who is the native and who becomes a foreign national is actually determined through these borders, and the question that turns one into a refugee, the new status that turns one into a refugee. So, we see local designations, local discriminations between different sections of different religious communities defined one community as a suspect, one section of people as a suspect as opposed to the other. So, between the first formal articulation of a separate nation state for the Muslims, that is in 1940 with the Lahore Resolution, also known as Pakistan Resolution, and the actual establishment of Pakistan, there was merely a span of 7 years. So, the boundaries between the two nation states were actually not known clearly until a long time, I mean, the boundaries of the new states were not known till some time even by the prominent leaders. And what is worse, no one could foresee that the exchange of population bloodbath that actually eventuated would become concomitant with this exchange of population. As we see that bloodbath is concomitant with the exchange of population that happens at the time of partition. So, the movie actually starts with a criticism of Sir Cyril Radcliffe's unawareness, someone who was right. So Radcliffe, someone who was someone who had no idea of the ethos, the culture of India, had been flown in to make this momentous decision, and this responsibility of the division of this country, such an important significant decision was carried out by him, which changed the fate of millions of people forever. So, refugee woman is something that Uditi Sen is interested in studying, and she says that she holds a very paradoxical, contradictory position vis-a-vis partition history. On the one hand, she becomes hyper visible, super visible as the chief sufferer of gendered violence, and yet on the other hand, once things start settling down, as soon as the focus as soon as things settle down, the focus shifts to the traumatic events. So, we see that on the one hand, the women are seen as the women are rendered a hyper visible status, and on the other, the focus actually shifts from the extraordinary and traumatic events to the mundane and prolonged affair of rehabilitation, where women actually are relegated to the margins. They actually disappear from the archives of the state. So, when we talk of refugee, we have also discussed how the patrilineal nuclear family was the relevant unit for being counted as a refugee case, let us say. So, the government of India understood the case of a refugee filed through the normative lens of a nuclear family by kind of giving importance to the normative nuclear family, which has the male head, and the woman is basically a partner to the male or akin to the male, but not automatically the head of the family. So, the male head of the family emerged as the generic refugee. Refugee as a term is actually, it has a gender connotation. It refers to the able-bodied male, and tacitly it also implies that such a male is belongs to middle class, lower middle class, and if such a refugee is a mouthpiece of its community, his community, then he automatically belongs to one of the upper castes. So the normative refugees figure has some caste, class, gender dimensions, and so we have the other refugees who are less refugees, and as compared to the mouthpiece, right. We have other refugees who are less refugees as compared to this mouthpiece. So, refugee women could expect to gain access to relief and rehabilitation through their male family members. So, all refugee women did not even fit into this refugee case or the ideal of the refugee. So, they became invisible in the rehabilitation process, or at least they were rendered a passive status. So, based on this, it can be inferred that the women from the brothel in the movie, coming back to Begum Jan, we can say that what was at stake for Begum Jan and her female her other female partners who were partners in the same trade. What was at stake For Begum Jan and her female partners who were in the same trade, what was at stake? We could understand that if they gave up the brothel, they would have nowhere to go. They would be rendered the status of, they would be rendered a further marginal status. They would become unattached refugee women. They would be hurled to, they would be thrown into refugee camps, permanent liability camps, and they would be converted into beggars. Basically, they would have to beg for their upkeep from the government, and it would be at the behest of the government that their survival happened. So, the government would give them doles, and through the government's welfareist policies, their lives would go on, which is not how they were presently living. They were presently at least in charge of their own lives. So, they would definitely suffer harder in the refugee camps, more so because they were not from any patrilineal nuclear family. Their demands in the camps might not be met simply because they did not have any male kin to claim doles for them or to demand on behalf of them. So, historians have read the state's promise of financial support for single and widowed refugee women in two diametrically opposite ways. So, I mean, there has always been these binary narratives about the refugee women either being very successfully rehabilitated through welfare policies by the government, or they being resorted, they being treated in an abject manner, or they are facing some kind of abjection. So, we see that either the historians are congratulating the post-colonial nation state for acting in the interest of the widows, the unattached women, or contrarily, the historians are indicting the state for discriminating against women and reducing these women into abject victims. So, within this binary formulation, or within this binary in this binary narratives, we basically do not get a clear cut picture of what actually happened to the refugee woman. It suggests a complex sphere of governance that cannot be actually determined through binary narratives. So, now, as if we look at the policies, there was a special women's section of the Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation that was set up under Rameshwari Nehru in order to handle the sensitive, delicate situation as well as the magnitude of problem posed by and inflicted on the refugee women. The process of recovery itself has been questioned by many critics. Not all women belonged to not all women qualified within this category. Only the extreme cases were being examined by the likes of Rameshwari Nehru and Mridula Sarabhai. So, victim and then Anis Kidwai too. So, victims of rape, recovered abducted women, women that had lost their male family members in riots, the widows, and also the ones that were abandoned by their families which fled, leaving them behind. These were some of the extreme cases which were being dealt with, which were being taken up by the female social workers. The less extreme cases of refugee women who were not indeed not raped or abducted were not somehow their questions or their crisis have not got registered officially. So, refugee women made their way into the official discourse, or they became visible in the official discourse of rehabilitation only through social rupture. Only if something abnormal happened to them did they become visible, otherwise not. So, the official term for such women who were regarded as exceptional cases was the unattached women. As soon as the refugee woman had a male kin, she was not automatically the state's burden or the state's liability. So, so we realize after looking based on this background information, when we see the characters in Begum Jaan, the female partners in Begum Jaan's sex trade, they stand as misfits for the definition of unattached women. They do not have any male support or familial ties in the first place. So, unattached women are basically the ones whose males have died in war or due to riots. These women do not have any males in the first place to lose. So, becoming a refugee would make their lives even more complicated at several levels. So, the post-colonial state privileges men that are head of a respective household as recipients of relief and rehabilitation on behalf of the entire family. So, the man actually represents the family as a unit. By implication, the state decreed that the normative position of women within the regime of rehabilitation was to be attached to some male kin. So, most of the women, refugee women, were subsumed within the patriarchal family, right. They were outside the purview of the women's section, which was dealing with the extreme cases of unattached women, right. The normal women never came into the picture, into the larger schema. The question of the normal refugee woman never appeared in the national picture, in the larger schema. So, the state reinforced by such designs, the state was reinforcing males' control over the females, the female family members, and it was thereby reproducing and normalizing through the regime of rehabilitation the new patriarchy of nuclear families. So, the unattached women, the care of unattached women who were seen as vulnerable citizens was relegated or was demarcated as a sphere of feminine intervention, which could be dealt with by the social workers and the philanthropic organizations. So, technically speaking, even government was not dealing with the cases of women. It was the social workers and the philanthropic organizations that dealt with such women's cases. At the highest level, it involved prominent social workers and nationalists such as Rameshwari Nehru, Mridula Sarabhai, Anis Kidwai, who had a history of working for women's rights and education. Now, what is the interface between these female social experts or workers and the unattached female refugees? It is not always a very smooth relationship. Such a relationship could also be hegemonic and forceful. I mean, because the social workers were treated as the know-it-all about the needs of the refugee women, and many a times the social workers would not even consult these women about what they needed, what they aspired to be, and or where they aspired to be. There were forceful relationship between the female social workers and the unattached women many a times. So, the drive to educate women, to train them to train them to make clothes or handicrafts, buy them sewing machines. All these trainings were coming from above and not from within. These were not suggestions given by the refugee women by and large. So, what we see is that the female social workers are an extension of the largely middle class ambitions and aspirations regarding what constituted progress and progress and goodness in the larger sense for the Indian woman. So, the refugee woman was not automatically allowed to decide her fate. It was the female social worker who acted as a wing of the government, who decided what how much they should get educated, what they should study, how they should earn their livelihood, what trainings and skills be given to them. It was not the refugee woman. So, the portrayal of the women in the movie Begum Jaan stands as a contrast to this popular portrayal of women in partition, where they are passive takers of whatever is being doled out to them. They do not have they do not have much at stake. So, the brothel work is a business for these women and their profession, and so they treat this house as both their workplace and their place of recreation, their shelter, their home. These women do not have any ties, like I have already said. They associate themselves with no caste or religion. They are beyond that. They have left their families behind them. So, that this house, this brothel house is the only thing that they possess, and they cannot give that away. They are not ready to forego the house. As a consequence, an attack on the house leaves the women with absolutely nothing. They are rendered a victim status and they become a victim of partition differently, and if we can say doubly, right. They are once raped, many of them are rape victims, they are victims of riots, and that is how they have landed up in the brothel. Now, once the brothel is taken away from them, they would be reduced to beggars. So, they are doubly victimized, and they are doubly harmed by the partition. With this, I am going to stop today's lecture, and let us meet again for another round of discussions. Thank you.